The morning the HOA demolition contractor pulled his equipment truck onto Millbrook Road and positioned it at the entrance to my stable yard, I was standing at the fence with a cup of coffee watching him set up, and my phone was already showing 3 missed calls from Nora Aldridge, the Clearfield Meadows board president, who had apparently just learned something in the previous 40 minutes that had transformed the situation from a straightforward demolition enforcement action into something she had not prepared for and did not know how to manage. I did not answer her calls. I watched the contractor position his skid steer loader, and I watched the 2 sheriff's department cruisers that had been parked on my property since 6 that morning, and I watched the moment the contractor saw the cruisers and stopped what he was doing and stood very still, and I drank my coffee and waited for the phone to ring again. My name is Callum Briggs. I am 55 years old, a licensed agricultural contractor and equine facility manager with 28 years of experience in horse management, stable construction, and working livestock operations, and I have lived on a 4-acre agricultural parcel at the northern edge of the Clearfield Meadows HOA development in rural western Kentucky for 9 years. My property predates the development by 31 years. I want to be clear about that because it becomes the most important fact in everything that followed. My land was here before Clearfield Meadows existed. My family has operated this parcel as an agricultural property since my father bought it in 1962. The stables, a 6-stall wooden structure with a hay loft, concrete aisle, and a covered wash rack, were built in 1987 by my father under a building permit pulled from the county in May of that year. I have that permit. I have the inspection certificate. I have 36 years of county tax records classifying the property as agricultural. I have everything because my father was the kind of man who kept everything, and I am my father's son. When Clearfield Meadows was developed 23 years ago, the developer had conducted a title and survey review of all adjacent parcels as required by county land use law. The review had identified my parcel as an existing agricultural property with grandfathered structures and had documented it in the development's founding CC and RS as an adjacent non-conforming use that was acknowledged and not subject to the development's architectural standards. This acknowledgement was in writing in the recorded CC and RS on page 4 in a section titled Adjacent Property Disclosures, and it had been there for 23 years. I want you to know that this acknowledgement existed before I tell you what Nora Aldridge did with it, because the contrast between what the CC and RS actually said and what Nora told people they said is the foundational fact of the entire situation. Nora had become board president 14 months ago, as I described in a prior account about my fuel cooperative, and she had spent those 14 months applying her former corporate procurement sensibility to community governance with a thoroughness that had generated significant documentation in my files. The fuel cooperative situation had been resolved. The settlement had been paid. Nora's tenure had continued because the HOA's governing documents did not permit removal of a board president mid-term, except by a supermajority vote that required a formal petition process that the community had not yet fully organized. She turned her attention to my stables 3 months after the fuel cooperative settlement. The catalyst was a complaint filed by a newer resident named Warren Holt, who had moved into Clearfield Meadows 8 months ago and whose lot was the closest residential property to my stable yard. Warren had filed a complaint with the board citing odor, noise from the horses during early morning hours, and what he described as an unsightly structure visible from his backyard. I understood Warren's complaint. Living adjacent to working horses is a genuine sensory experience, and not everyone finds it pleasant. I had managed neighbor relations with care for 9 years and had made specific operational adjustments over the years to minimize impact, including modified feeding schedules that reduced early morning noise, regular manure management that exceeded county requirements, and a landscape buffer along the shared boundary that I had planted and maintained at my own expense. Warren was a newer resident who had perhaps not fully researched what living adjacent to an agricultural parcel would mean in practice. What I did not understand was Nora's response to the complaint, which was not to engage with the operational concerns or acknowledge the CC and RS existing disclosure language, but to send me a formal enforcement notice asserting that my stables were non-conforming structures in violation of the community's architectural standards, and directing me to present a demolition plan within 60 days. I read the notice at my kitchen table. I read the adjacent property disclosures section of the CC and RS on my phone at the same time. The contrast was so complete that I sat for a moment, simply confirming that I was reading the same document that Nora's letter cited. I called James Waller. He had handled my fuel cooperative matter and knew my property documentation well. I read him the enforcement notice and the adjacent property disclosures section. He said the CC and RS explicitly acknowledge your stables as a grandfathered agricultural structure on an adjacent non-conforming use parcel. The enforcement notice cites the architectural standards section, which by its own terms does not apply to your property. This notice is either a misreading of the CC and RS or a deliberate misrepresentation of them. I said Nora read the CC and RS carefully when she became president. She presented sections of them verbatim at board meetings during the fuel cooperative dispute. She knows what is in them. James was quiet for a moment. He said, "Then this is deliberate. She is using an enforcement framework she knows does not apply. Hopping you will either not read the CC and RS carefully enough to identify the error, or will find the formal process intimidating enough to comply without challenging it." I said, "She is wrong on both counts." He said, "I know. I am going to send a response that is very specific about the adjacent property disclosures language, and I want to include a request for a formal board acknowledgement that the enforcement notice was issued in error." The response went out the following week. It was 8 pages, and it quoted the CC and RS extensively, and it included a copy of the 1987 building permit and a copy of the county's current agricultural classification of my parcel, and a copy of the development's founding survey documents identifying my parcel as adjacent non-conforming use. It was, as James described it to me, a document that left no reasonable interpretation available except the correct one. Nora's response arrived in 2 weeks. It was 2 pages, and it maintained the enforcement position. It said the adjacent property disclosures section acknowledged the existence of the adjacent parcel, but did not create a permanent exemption from community standards for structures on that parcel, and that the board's reading of the CC and RS was that all structures visible from the development were subject to review. James called me after reading it. He said, "She just argued that the adjacent property disclosures section does not exempt your property from architectural standards review despite the fact that the section is titled Adjacent Property Disclosures and explicitly states that the identified properties are acknowledged as non-conforming uses not subject to community architectural review." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want this in front of a judge. I am going to file for declaratory judgment asking the court to interpret the CC and RS language definitively." I said, "Do it." He filed the declaratory judgment petition in the county circuit court 2 weeks later. The petition asked the court to declare that my property was covered by the adjacent property disclosures section and was not subject to Clearfield Meadows architectural standards enforcement. It included the full CC and RS, the founding survey documents, and the 1987 building permit. The court set a hearing date 6 weeks out. In those 6 weeks, the situation developed 2 additional dimensions that I had not anticipated. The first was that Warren Holt escalated his complaint, not to the HOA this time, to the county zoning board, asserting that my stables were an illegal non-conforming structure that had not been properly permitted. The county zoning board pulled my records, found the 1987 permit and the agricultural classification, confirmed the structures were legally permitted grandfathered facilities, and closed the complaint. I received a copy of the closure notice and added it to my files. The second dimension was more significant and more interesting. 18 months earlier, I had entered into an agreement with the county sheriff's department to house 4 of their mounted patrol horses at my facility. The sheriff's department maintained a mounted patrol unit that participated in community events, crowd management at large gatherings, and rural trail patrol in the county's conservation areas. They had been looking for a suitable facility after their prior boarding arrangement had ended, and my stables were well suited for their needs, properly equipped, properly maintained, and located in a county they patrolled. The agreement was a standard county vendor contract. The sheriff's department paid me a monthly boarding rate for 4 stalls, feed management, and daily care. I was a licensed contractor, and the contract went through the county procurement process. The agreement was public record, filed with the county clerk's office, as all county vendor contracts were required to be. I had not advertised this agreement within the HOA community. I had not hidden it either. It was public record for anyone who searched the county vendor contracts database, which was accessible online and updated monthly. I had not considered it relevant to the HOA situation because my stables were not subject to HOA oversight regardless of whose horses were in them. Nora apparently did not know about the agreement when she issued the demolition enforcement notice. She apparently did not know about it when she maintained the enforcement position in response to James's 8-page letter. And she apparently did not know about it on the morning she authorized the demolition contractor to proceed with site preparation. What changed the morning of the contractor's arrival was a phone call. The call came to Nora at 6:15 that morning. It came from the sheriff himself, a man named Sheriff Dale Mackey, who had been the county's elected sheriff for 11 years and who had the direct manner of a man who had not needed to be anything other than direct for a long time. Dale called Nora's personal cell phone, the number he had obtained from the county HOA registration records, and he told her that 4 horses belonging to the county sheriff's department were currently stabled at the Briggs property, that those horses were county property used in active law enforcement operations, that his department had a valid county vendor contract for their housing at that facility, and that if a demolition contractor showed up at the Briggs property and interfered with county law enforcement assets and infrastructure, he was going to have a significant problem on his hands that he was not going to be able to solve with an HOA enforcement notice. Dale told me about the call afterward. He said Nora had been quiet for most of it and had said at the end that she would look into the situation. Dale said he had told her that looking into it was a good idea and that he hoped her looking into it would happen quickly given that his contractor was already on Millbrook Road. Nora called the contractor. The contractor, to his credit, had already stopped when he saw the 2 sheriff's cruisers on my property. The deputies had arrived at 6 that morning at Dale's direction, not to enforce anything, but to be visibly present at county property while the vendor contract was active and county assets were on site. They were parked in my stable yard drinking coffee from a thermos, and they had been there for 40 minutes when the contractor arrived. The contractor called Nora from the road. Nora called him back and told him to stand by. He stood by for 22 minutes while I drank my coffee and watched him from the fence. Then Nora called him again and told him to stand down and leave the site. He left. Nora's 3 calls to me came in the 22 minutes while the contractor was standing by. I did not answer them. I let the situation exist as it existed, and I let her understand the full dimensions of it without my assistance. James called me at 9 that morning. He had been monitoring the situation because I had told him the contractor was scheduled, and because James monitored situations he was professionally involved in. He said, "I understand the contractor left." I said, "He left about an hour ago." He said, "I understand there were sheriff's vehicles on your property." I said, "Dale Mackey sent 2 deputies to be present while county assets were on site." James said, "That is elegant." I said Dale thought of it himself. I did not ask for it. James said, "Nora called me this morning after she called you. She wants to discuss resolution." I said, "The declaratory judgment hearing is in 4 weeks. I am comfortable letting the court issue the declaration." James said, "I know." But Nora apparently had a conversation with the county attorney this morning after speaking with Dale Mackey, and the county attorney has advised her that proceeding with demolition enforcement against a facility housing county law enforcement assets under a valid vendor contract would create county liability exposure that would significantly exceed anything the HOA could manage. The county attorney's position is apparently that Nora should resolve this immediately. I said, "What kind of resolution is she proposing?" He said she wants to withdraw the enforcement notice and issue a formal acknowledgement that your property is covered by the adjacent property disclosures section. I said those are two of the three things I need. The third is a formal apology to the community acknowledging that the enforcement notice was issued in error. James said, "I will convey that." Nora accepted all three conditions within the hour. The formal acknowledgement was prepared by her attorney and filed with the court as a resolution of the declaratory judgment petition. The enforcement notice was formally withdrawn. The community-wide letter acknowledging the error went to all 23 households within the week. The letter described the situation with the specific careful language of someone who had been advised by counsel about what to say and what not to say. It said the board had reviewed the adjacent property disclosures section of the CC&RS and had determined that the enforcement notice issued to the Briggs property had been based on an incorrect reading of that section and was withdrawn. It said the board apologized for any concern the notice had caused. Gerald Fitch, my former board president neighbor, called me after receiving the letter. He said, "Incorrect reading." I said, "That is what the letter says." He said she read the adjacent property disclosures section of the CC&RS that says your property is not subject to architectural standards review and issued an enforcement notice saying your property was subject to architectural standards review. I said that is what happened. He said, and it cost her a demolition contractor's mobilization fee and a conversation with the sheriff and a community apology letter. I said, and a county attorney call, and a withdrawn declaratory judgment petition, and James's fees. Gerald said, James's fees come from where? I said, from Nora personally, as part of the resolution agreement, $4,800. Gerald was quiet for a moment, then he said, the horses are still there. I said, the horses are still there. The vendor contract runs through next March. He said, Dale Mackey's horses. I said, 4 of them, good animals. The deputies who come to check on them seem to enjoy visiting. Gerald laughed. He said good night, and I said good night, and I went out to the stable yard to do the evening check. The 4 county horses were in their stalls, eating, settled, exactly as they had been every evening for 18 months. My own 2 horses were in the adjacent stalls. The stable smelled like hay and horses and the specific organic richness of a working agricultural facility that had been operating correctly for 36 years. I walked the aisle and checked each stall and confirmed water and feed and noted any health concerns in the daily log I kept for the vendor contract, the same log I would submit to the county each month as part of my contractor reporting requirement. Everything was as it should be. I turned off the aisle lights and walked back to the house. The property was quiet in the way rural properties are quiet in the evening, the specific quiet of land that has been in the same family for 61 years and has settled into itself, the way land does when it is worked consistently and cared for consistently and not asked to be anything other than what it is. The stables were where they had been since 1987. The permit was in my files where it had been since my father put it there. The adjacent property disclosures section was in the CC&RS, where the developer had put it 23 years ago. All of these things had been true before Nora Aldridge arrived in Clearfield Meadows, and they were still true after she issued her enforcement notice, and they would be true after she left. I went inside and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and updated my documentation folder with the day's events. The declaratory judgment petition was withdrawn and resolved. The enforcement notice was formally withdrawn. The acknowledgement letter had gone to 23 households. Nora's personal payment to James was confirmed. The folder was current and complete. The stables were standing. The horses were fed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Thumbnail text: HOA sent a demolition crew. Then they noticed the sheriff's department horses in the stable.